Sentences march across conversations like military formations. The Rhineland had had an autonomous history until it was acquired by Prussia in 1814–15. At the same time, he exuded vitality and self-assurance. His style was the antithesis of the blaring charismatic quality of the Hitler era and aspired to the serene authority of the pre-First World War generation, which had operated while governed by restraint and shared values. All of these qualities, together with the standing he had acquired by a decade of ostentatious aloofness from Hitler, made Adenauer the most obvious candidate to lead the new Democratic Party. But he was not above practical maneuvers to achieve his end. The first CDU meeting was set up with one chair positioned at the head of the table. Adenauer strode up to it and announced, "I was born on January 5, 1876, so I am probably the oldest person here. If nobody objects, I will regard myself as president by seniority." That elicited both laughter and acquiescence. From that point on, he would steward the party for over 15 years. The CDU program, which Adenauer played a key role in developing, urged Germans to reject their past and to embrace a spirit of renewal based on Christian ideals and democratic principles. Away with the slogans of a vanished time, away with the fatigue of life and state. The same hardship forces all of us to get to work. It would be a betrayal of one's own family and of the German people to sink now into nihilism or indifference. The CDU appeals to all those forces newly willing to build on unflinching confidence in the good qualities of the German people, and the indomitable determination to make the Christian idea and the high ideal of true democracy the basis of renewal. Throughout, Adenauer was always conscious of, perhaps obsessed by, the possibility of tragedy. Germany, in his view, was not strong enough morally or materially to stand alone, and any attempt to do so would end in disaster. Located in the center of the continent, the new Germany needed to abandon many of its previous policies and attitudes, particularly the opportunistic manipulation of its geographic position and the Prussian inclination for good relations with Russia. Prussia, the taproot of German militarism, would be formally abolished as a state within Germany by the Allies in 1947. Adenauer's Germany would instead anchor its democracy domestically in its Catholic regions and ecumenical Christian values, and internationally in federation with the West, especially in security ties with the United States. Untouched by wartime air attacks, the bucolic university town of Bonn had been selected as the temporary capital of the FRG pending reunification, when Berlin would once again serve as the capital. It was also Adenauer's personal preference, situated close to his home village of Rendorf and away from the turmoil of politics. Adenauer was able to effect the choice of Bonn in September 1948, before becoming chancellor, because of his influence as leader of the CDU and president of the Parliamentary Council, a group of German political figures that had been tasked by the Allies with planning the political evolution and drawing up a new constitution, or basic law. He later quipped that he had convinced the council to endorse Bonn only because Rendorf was too small, population under 2,000, to serve as a capital. He had also, less humorously, rejected the much more cosmopolitan Munich because of Bavaria's reputation for impetuous sentimentality and, as he deprecatingly remarked, because the capital should not lie cheek by jowl with potato fields. Adenauer also disdained major cities such as Frankfurt, site of a short-lived parliament in 1848, where democracy's prospects might be distorted by public demonstrations and riots. The restoration of civil order and the inauguration of the chancellor. In 1946, German reconstruction slowly began. Elections were called for progressively higher levels of administration, restoring structures and shifting political responsibility steadily to the Germans themselves. In January 1947, the US and Britain established a common economic policy for their zones. France joined the following year, making it the Trizone. The economist Ludwig Erhard was appointed as director of the Economic Council and oversaw the smooth transition to the new currency, the Deutschmark. He coupled it with eliminating both price controls and rationing. Erhard's bold economic policy inspired a recovery that eventually enabled political reconstruction, based on a constitution approved by the Allied powers. On May 23, 1949, 4 years after unconditional surrender, the new German constitution, the Basic Law, took effect, and the Federal Republic was formally established, comprising the 3 Western zones. The German Democratic Republic, replacing the Soviet occupation zone, would be formally constituted several months later. The partition of Germany now mirrored the dividing lines in Europe. The process culminated in an election for a parliament, the Bundestag, in August. On September 15, the Bundestag voted for a chancellor who, by the constitution, required an absolute majority and who could only be removed by an absolute majority vote for a named successor, a stabilizing measure. Although Adenauer was elected by a margin of only 1 vote, presumably his own, in this parliament of a rump state, he managed to win 4 consecutive elections, serving for 14 years. Germany's sovereignty, however, remained severely constrained. The Allies, who exercised paramount authority over occupied West Germany through their respective high commissioners, officially averred that the German people would enjoy self-government to the maximum possible degree. But they identified a set of issues, ranging from foreign affairs to the use of funds, food, and other supplies, over which the 3 high commissioners and other occupation authorities would have final say. The Occupation Statute, from which the quotations above are drawn and which was enacted 2 weeks prior to the Federal Republic's establishment in May, stood above the Basic Law. A related document, the Ruhr Statute, established Allied control over the eponymous industrial center and laid out criteria for the dismantling of German industry for reparations. Another industrial base, the Saar Valley, was however given a special autonomous status at a comparatively early stage. The tension between maintaining Allied authority and restoring German self-government was especially evident on September 21, 1949, when the 3 high commissioners gathered in Bonn to welcome Adenauer as the new Chancellor of the Federal Republic, and the first legitimate successor to Hitler. Adenauer had affirmed before the ceremony that he would not challenge the partition of Germany, and the impairment of its sovereignty by the various statutes imposed by the Allies as a price for unconditional surrender. But he used the occasion of inauguration to demonstrate that he would do so with dignity and self-respect. Beyond the border of the red carpet where the high commissioners had assembled, a place had been set aside for him. As the ceremony began, and in utter violation of protocol, Adenauer abandoned his place and moved to the carpet alongside the high commissioners, indicating that the new Federal Republic would insist on equal status in the future, even as it accepted the consequences of Germany's past transgressions. In a brief acceptance speech, Adenauer emphasized that, as Chancellor, he accepted the Occupation Statute and other limitations on sovereignty. Germany's subordination to its provisions, he pointed out, had been combined in the statute with its partition. In recognition of his acceptance of these sacrifices, he therefore urged the High Commissioners to apply the provisions of the various statutes in a liberal and generous manner, and to make use of the clauses allowing for changes and developments that might enable the German people to achieve full freedom in due course. The core of his acceptance speech was not the appeal to the victors for generosity but Adenauer's unprecedented vision of the new Europe to which he was committing the new Germany. Disavowing any return to the nationalism or motivations of pre-war Europe, Adenauer outlined the case for building a positive and viable European federation, designed to overcome the narrow nationalistic conception of states as it prevailed in the 19th and early 20th centuries. If we now turn back to the sources of our European civilization, born of Christianity, then we cannot fail to succeed in restoring the unity of European life in all fields of endeavor. This is the sole effective assurance for maintaining peace. Adenauer's speech implied a profound transformation of his country. Within the context of unconditional surrender, it was also a shrewd appeal to equality with the victors, the only such claim available to Germany. The speech also opened more fundamental vistas. The new chancellor was simultaneously accepting the indefinite, possibly permanent, division of his country and proclaiming a foreign policy in partnership with the foreign powers that were now occupying it. While acknowledging Germany's submission, he was announcing national objectives of federation with his country's historic adversaries in Europe and of alliance with the United States. Adenauer put forward these visionary ideas without rhetorical flourish. The duties of nations, as he viewed them, were their own justification. Oratorical embellishment could only distract from that basic understanding. Adenauer's unobtrusive style also suggested the role he foresaw for the new Germany in helping to shape a new Europe through consensus. Not for more than a century had a European leader confronted the challenge of returning his country to the international order. France had been totally defeated at the end of the Napoleonic Wars and its capital occupied by foreign forces, but French national unity was unimpaired, and the post-war Congress of Vienna accepted Talleyrand as a senior representative of France with equal rights as a historic state. Konrad Adenauer shouldered his comparable task under much more forbidding circumstances. His neighbors did not accept his country as an equal. For them, Germany was still very much on probation. For a demoralized, defeated society, the passage to the restoration of democratic sovereignty presents one of the most difficult challenges to statesmanship. The victors are reluctant to grant to an erstwhile enemy the legal authority, much less the capacity, to recover its strength. The prostrate loser assesses progress by the degree and speed at which it is able to regain control over its future. Adenauer had the inner resources to transcend these tensions. His strategy of humility was composed of 4 elements: accepting the consequences of defeat, regaining the confidence of the victors, building a democratic society, and creating a European federation that would transcend the historic divisions of Europe. The path to a new national identity. Adenauer considered strengthening ties with the West and especially the United States as the key to the restoration of Germany's place in the world. In his memoirs, Dean Acheson would enthusiastically describe his first meeting as U.S. Secretary of State with Adenauer in 1949. "I was struck by the imagination and wisdom of his approach. His great concern was to integrate Germany completely into Western Europe. Indeed, he gave this end priority over the reunification of unhappily divided Germany, and could see why her neighbors might look upon it as almost a precondition to reunification. He wanted Germans to be citizens of Europe, to cooperate, with France especially, in developing common interests and outlook and in burying the rivalries of the past few centuries. They must lead in the rebirth of Europe." The United States was instrumental in supporting these goals with an economic revival plan. On June 5, 1947, General George C. Marshall, Atchison's predecessor as Secretary of State and formerly Army Chief of Staff, had articulated it at Harvard University. Our policy is directed not against any country or doctrine but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. Its purpose should be the revival of a working economy in the world so as to permit the emergence of political and social conditions in which free institutions can exist. Adenauer took the Marshall speech and subsequent formal plan as reason to acquiesce to the 1949 Ruhr Agreement, one of the other means by which the Allies retained control over German industry. He interpreted the Marshall Plan as a break on exactions from Germany, but more crucially as a first step toward the federalization of Europe. If the Ruhr Statute is used as an instrument to hold down the German economy, the Marshall Plan is nonsense. If, however, the Ruhr Statute is used as an instrument in the German and the European interest, if it means the beginning of a new economic order in Western Europe, then it can become a promising starting point for European cooperation. It was ironic that the German Social Democratic Party, SPD, under the leadership of Kurt Schumacher, now emerged as Adenauer's principal domestic opponent. The SPD had a history of deep commitment to democracy, dating back to the creation of the German state, but during the imperial period it had been isolated from the leadership groups since, as a Marxist party, it had not been considered reliably nationalist. Its current leader, Schumacher, in ill health as a result of over a decade of imprisonment under Hitler, convinced himself that his party would never win a post-war election unless it established itself as national in its purpose. He therefore opposed Adenauer's strategy of restoration by submission. As a people we have to make German policy, which means a policy which is not determined by a foreign will, but which is the product of the will of our people. A kind of populism became Schumacher's insistent demand. However understandable in terms of SPD history, it was incompatible with unconditional surrender or with Europe's experience of Germany under Hitler. Adenauer shared the SPD's democratic principles, but there was also a strategic rationale for his embrace of democracy. He was determined to turn submission into a virtue, and he saw that a temporary inequality of conditions was the precondition to equality of status. During parliamentary debates in November 1949, he emphasized this by shouting, which was highly unusual for him, "Who do you think lost the war? Submission was the only way forward. The Allies have told me that the dismantling of factories would be stopped only if I satisfy the Allied desire for security," he explained before Riley asking, "Does the Socialist Party want dismantling to go on to the bitter end?" Another basic Adenauer objective was reconciliation with France. Adenauer had met Robert Schuman, then France's foreign minister, for the first time in 1948. At that time French policy was aimed at disabling German industrial production and placing the Saar region under French control. Adenauer redefined the issue. The ultimate challenge was not strategic or financial but political and ethical. In July 1949, before becoming chancellor, he pursued this theme in a letter to Schuman. "In my view, any economic advantage gained by another country as a result of being allocated dismantled factories is dwarfed by the great damage being done to the morale of the German people. I implore you, since you have such a special appreciation of the issue of reconciliation between France and Germany, and of the principle of European cooperation, to find ways and means to terminate these completely incomprehensible measures." At home, Adenauer stressed that cooperation with the Allies' various punitive measures was the only wise course. On November 3, 1949, he gave an interview to the German weekly Die Zeit. If we simply show a negative response towards the Statute of the Ruhr and the Ruhr Authority, France will interpret this as a sign of German nationalism, as an act of defiance rejecting all surveillance. Such an attitude would appear to be passive resistance against security itself. And that above all must be avoided. Adenauer's approach proved effective. Later that month, the Allies invited him to negotiate a new relationship with the occupation authority, reducing the number of factories marked for dismantlement and establishing a path for Germany's accession to the Council of Europe, which had been founded that year. On November 24, he presented the new agreement to a Bundestag in which nationalism was still rampant. Schumacher was so carried away that he called Adenauer the Chancellor of the Allies. Suspended from Parliament for this slur, Schumacher was soon reinstated and immediately renewed his attack. In reply, Adenauer stressed that humility was the road to equality. I believe that in everything we do, we must be clear that we, as a result of total collapse, are without power. One must be clear that in the negotiations, which we Germans must conduct with the Allies in order to come progressively into ever greater possession of power, the psychological moment plays a very large role. One cannot demand and expect trust from the outset. We cannot and must not assume that with the others there has occurred suddenly a complete change in mood toward Germany, but that instead trust can only be recovered slowly, bit by bit. Adenauer's approach was more warmly received by Germany's neighbors than by his domestic critics. In March 1950, the Council of Europe invited the Federal Republic to join it, albeit only as an associate member. In a memorandum to his cabinet, Adenauer urged accession despite the discriminatory status. It is as yet the only way. I must warn against saddling Germany with the odium of having brought the European negotiations to nothing. 3 months later, Robert Schuman, eager to tie Germany to France, put forward a plan to supersede and replace the Ruhr Authority. Published on May 9, 1950, the Schuman Plan would lead to the creation of a European Coal and Steel Community, ECSC, superficially a common market for these commodities, but whose essential goal was political. With such an agreement, Schuman declared, war between France and Germany becomes not merely unthinkable, but materially impossible. At a press conference, Adenauer endorsed the plan in similar terms, saying it had created the genuine foundation for the elimination of all future conflict between France and Germany. In a meeting with Jean Monnet, Commissioner General of the French National Planning Commission and later First President, 1952-5, of the ECSC High Authority, Adenauer reinforced Schumann's point. The various governments involved should not be so much concerned with their technical responsibilities as with their moral responsibility in the face of the great hopes that this proposal has aroused. In a letter to Schuman on May 23, 1950, Adenauer again emphasized the non-material objectives. In fact, we will succeed only if we do not let our work be guided solely by technical and economic considerations, but put it on an ethical basis. The Schuman Plan accelerated German entry into a unifying Europe. As Adenauer put it in a February 1951 speech in Bonn, the Schuman Plan serves the goal of building a unified Europe. For that reason, from the very beginning we have taken up the idea that animates the Schuman Plan with approval. We have stayed true to this idea even though sometimes things have been extremely difficult for us. The ECSC Charter was initialed on March 19, 1951. The following January, the Bundestag ratified it by a vote of 378 to 143, 38. The Bundesrat, the upper house representing the 10 states of the Federal Republic, demonstrated lingering German national sentiment by calling on Adenauer to ensure that the Allied High Commission abolished all the restraints on iron and steel production in Germany and that West Berlin was expressly included in the territory covered by the ECSC. In the event, West Berlin was specifically included in ECSC territory, and German steel and coal production increased under the auspices of the new community. What is more, as Schuman had proposed, the ECSC officially replaced the unpopular, at least in Germany, Ruhr Authority. In only 2 years after becoming Chancellor, Adenauer had achieved Germany's participation in European integration, and he had done so by a policy which strove to overcome Germany's past. His motivation was undoubtedly partly tactical and national as well as ethical. But tactics had been merged with strategy, and his strategy was being transformed into history. The Soviet challenge and rearmament. The Soviet Union considered the rebuilding of the West German economy and the progressive establishment of German political institutions as a direct challenge. The communist threat began to eclipse the Western democracy's fear of a resurgent Germany when, in June 1948, the Soviet Union blockaded the access routes to Berlin from the surrounding Soviet occupation zone. This was a challenge to the four-power arrangement for the governance of Berlin, which had been established at the Potsdam Summit in 1945. In the end, the U.S. airlift to West Berlin overcame Soviet blackmail. America made clear that it would not permit the collapse of Berlin and would resort to military escalation to open the access routes, if necessary. In May 1949, Stalin called off the blockade. On October 7, 1949, the Soviet Union turned its occupation zone into a sovereign, though satellite, state, sealing the partition of Germany. In this process of escalating commitment, the United States and its allies established what grew into a pillar of American policy, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. In what amounted to a unilateral American guarantee of its territory, the Federal Republic was put under the protection of NATO in 1949, although it still remained unarmed and was not technically a member of the organization. But 1 year later, in 1950, the North Korean invasion of South Korea persuaded the Allies that they were facing an overriding communist challenge. President Truman, responding to European pleas, appointed General Dwight D. Eisenhower as Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. The general insisted that the defense of Europe required 30 divisions, approximately 450,000 soldiers, a number that could not be reached without German participation. America's allies were understandably ambivalent at the prospect that the very country under whose aggression they had suffered a few years earlier should now contribute a significant military component to Western defense. At first, Western Europe's leaders insisted that the troops assigned to the defense of Germany should be supplied by other countries. But upon reflection, and under American pressure, most European leaders accepted that the defense of Germany could not be assured without a German military contribution. In his memoirs, Adenauer would reflect on how the Korean War had put an end to the remnants of the policy of weakening Germany. It was in the interest of the United States that Germany should become strong once more. Therefore, the many examples of discrimination, such as the Ruhr Statute, the Occupation Statute, and the provisions regarding the rearming of Germany, could only be of a transitory nature. Adenauer considered German rearmament to be necessary for the sake of Europe as well as for the recovery of Germany's political identity. Having first discouraged public debate on the subject so as not to interfere with progress toward German membership in European institutions, he soon reversed himself. Allied confidence might be shaken, he argued, if West Germany could not be trusted, or did not trust itself, with its own defense. German rearmament was formally proposed by Britain and the United States in August 1950 and quickly endorsed by Germany. France reacted half-heartedly with the Pleven Plan, which in October 1950 proposed a European army of mixed nationalities including German units. A draft treaty was drawn up, providing for the creation of a European Defence Community, EDC, that would include an integrated German contingent. A bitter controversy followed after Adenauer briefed key deputies of the German parliament on the contents of the draft treaty. Schumacher went so far as to call the treaty a triumph for the Allied, clerical coalition against the German people. In March 1952, to head off a European defense community and German rearmament, Stalin formally offered German unification under 5 conditions. A. All occupying forces, including Soviet, would be withdrawn within 1 year. B. United Germany would have a neutral status and not enter into any alliances. C. United Germany would accept the 1945 frontiers, that is, the Oder-Neisse line that constituted the disputed post-war border with Poland. D. The German economy would not be limited by conditions imposed by outsiders, in other words, abolishing the Ruhr Statute limiting the German economy, and E. United Germany would have the right to develop its own armed forces. These proposals were addressed to the Western Allies, emphasizing Germany's secondary position. Was Stalin's offer genuine, or was he attempting to embarrass Adenauer by maneuvering him into the position of appearing to prefer a divided Germany within Europe over a united, national, neutral Germany? In effect, Stalin was asking Adenauer to abandon all the progress he had made toward European integration in return for unification. Contemporary evidence suggests that Stalin made this offer only after receiving repeated assurances from his foreign minister that it would be refused. Nonetheless, it put Adenauer in a difficult position. For the first time since unconditional surrender, the issue of the country's unification had been formally placed before the Allied powers and the German people. In Germany, Schumacher argued that the opportunity to negotiate must not be missed and that the German Bundestag should refuse to ratify the European Defense Community until the Stalin Note had been explored. Anybody who approves the EDC in these present circumstances, he argued, can no longer call himself German. Adenauer stood fast. He understood that a negotiation was likely to deadlock and move the unification of Germany onto an ideological terrain, on which it stood alone, to be feared by all sides. Should it act unilaterally, the negotiation would turn into the battleground on which Europeans fought out their internecine rivalries. To avoid such choices, Adenauer evaded taking a public position on the Stalin offer by postponing discussion of it until the concept of free elections had been accepted by all the occupying countries and built into the constitution of a unifying Germany. In the meantime, he advocated the ratification of the EDC treaty in the name of a common Allied defense. This approach set off what the British Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden called a "battle of the notes." Adenauer was supported by Eisenhower, then a candidate for the presidency of the United States and, until May 30, 1952, still Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. More concerned by the prospect of a neutral Germany than by Soviet pressure, Britain and France acceded to Adenauer's gambit. The consensus was expressed in Allied notes sent to the Kremlin on March 25 and May 13, which demanded free elections in both West and East Germany as a prelude to unification. The Soviet response on May 24 asserted that the Allied notes had stalled any possibility of German reunification for an indefinite period. with renewed urgency to demonstrate the potential of the European project. Now that it had come at the apparent expense of German unification, on May 26, 1952, Adenauer signed the contractual agreements on the European Defence Community. But many in France remained unwilling to reconcile themselves to sharing an army with a nation with which their country had fought wars in every generation since the 16th century, which had devastated part of their country in the First World War and occupied all of it in the Second. 2 years after the agreement, on August 30, 1954, the French National Assembly refused to ratify the EDC, while also discarding the Pleven Plan. Calling this a "black day for Europe," Adenauer expressed his concerns to the representatives of Luxembourg and Belgium. "I am firmly convinced, 100% convinced, that the national army to which French Prime Minister Pierre Mendès France is forcing us will be a great danger for Germany and Europe. When I am no longer on hand, I don't know what will become of Germany, unless we still manage to create Europe in time." Because of these premonitions, Adenauer abandoned the EDC project and personally conducted secret negotiations with the Allies on the outlines of a German national army. American leadership proved pivotal. Elected president in November 1952, Eisenhower had decided that the unification of Europe and its joint defense, including the Federal Republic of Germany, was, in the words of one historian, a kind of skeleton key, unlocking the solution to a number of problems at once, and most important, providing a type of dual containment. The Soviet Union could be kept out, and Germany kept in Europe, with neither able to dominate the continent. Together with British Foreign Secretary Eden, Eisenhower forged a modification of the EDC treaty that allowed the development of a German army. Less than a decade after unconditional surrender, NATO would consist of federated national forces including those of Germany. A trip by Adenauer to Washington in 1953 marked a high point of these efforts. On April 8, he visited the tomb of the unknown soldier. The German flag, the black, red, and gold tricolor of the Federal Republic, not the black, sword-bearing eagle of Prussia or the swastika of the Thousand-Year Reich, was raised above Arlington National Cemetery. As the Chancellor strode toward the tomb, a 21-gun salute sounded in a scene with which Adenauer would end the 1945-53 volume of his memoirs. An American band played the German national anthem. I saw how tears were running down the face of one of my companions, and I, too, was deeply moved. It had been a long and hard road from the total catastrophe of the year 1945 to this moment of the year 1953, when the German national anthem was heard in the National Cemetery of the United States. Adenauer rebuilt the German armed forces throughout his remaining years in office without resurrecting Germany's historical intermittent militarism. By early 1964, the Bundeswehr had reached an overall strength of 415,000 officers and enlisted men. One historian describes it as the tip of the spear of the NATO alliance and linchpin of the defense of Western Europe against a conventional Soviet attack. More than this, the army was the backstop of the FRG's re-entry into international diplomacy, a tangible sign that the new Germany was both trusted by the Atlantic Alliance and a responsible contributor to the common defense. Adenauer would draw on the political capital accumulated during the formation of NATO to achieve his underlying quest to bring the occupation of Germany to an end. To attain full membership in NATO and proceed with the dismantling of the occupation statute, Adenauer agreed in 1954 to postpone the resolution of the Saar territory, which Paris sought to maintain as a neutral protectorate under French occupation, until 1957. It took complicated parliamentary maneuvers to induce the Bundestag to ratify both treaties in February 1955. When the treaties took effect on May 5, 1955, the Federal Republic became a sovereign state once more. Whereas, 6 years earlier, Adenauer's election had been ratified by the Allied High Commissioners, now they accepted their own dissolution. Adenauer stood on the steps of his office complex, the Palais Schaumburg, as the German flag was raised over government buildings throughout Bonn. Adenauer's first great task, ensuring the peaceful, swift, and amicable end of the occupation statute, had been accomplished. 2 days later, to symbolize his country's commitment to full partnership in Europe and the Atlantic Alliance, Adenauer led a delegation to Paris, where Germany assumed equal status within NATO. In 6 fateful years, Adenauer had brought his country from post-war partition, restrictions under the occupation statute and reparations to participation in the European community, and full membership in NATO. The strategy of humility had achieved its goal of equality in a new structure for Europe that Adenauer's inauguration had signified: the inextricable past, reparations to the Jewish people. The ethical basis for foreign policy on which Adenauer had relied in Germany's dealings with the Western Allies was especially complex. In relation to the Jewish people, Nazi crimes against Jews had been uniquely sweeping, savage, and single-minded. Some 6 million, more than 1/3 of the world Jewish population, were murdered in a methodically planned and executed policy of wholesale extermination. Toward the end of the war, the Western Allies assigned Nazi crimes to automatic arrest categories, to be implemented by Allied intelligence personnel and based in part on an accused perpetrator's rank in the Nazi Party. By the beginning of the occupation, such criminal categorization applied to tens of thousands of individuals. As the government was progressively turned over to the Federal Republic, so was the denazification process, which thereby became a German domestic political issue. Adenauer considered reparations to the Jewish people a moral duty as well as unqualifiedly in the German national self-interest. His commitment to the denazification process was more opaque, since he was also head of the CDU and in that capacity keenly aware that a rigorous effort would affect a significant proportion of voters. Adenauer therefore restricted the denazification process to a politically manageable number and argued less for retribution than for domestic reconciliation and compensation for the Holocaust's surviving victims. In practice, this meant focusing war crime investigations primarily on high-ranking former Nazis or on officials whose specific crimes could be proved in a court of law. This of course allowed for a wide span of ambiguity, illustrated by the fact that Hans Globk, a drafter of the Nuremberg race laws, became Adenauer's chief of staff. At the same time, Adenauer never wavered from affirming the moral obligations imposed on Germany by the Nazi past. Therefore, as a symbol of repentance and as a bridge toward justice and reconciliation with the Jewish people, he committed the Federal Republic to discussions on reparations with Jewish leaders and also with Israel, which he acknowledged as representative of the Jewish people as a whole. In March 1951, the Israeli government sent a request to the 4 occupying powers and the 2 German governments for reparations to survivors and heirs in the amount of $1.5 billion. Neither the Soviet Union nor the German Democratic Republic ever replied directly. Adenauer replied, however, on behalf of the Federal Republic, addressing the Bundestag on September 27, 1951. In the name of the German people, unspeakable crimes were committed which require moral and material reparation. Wiedergutmachung. These crimes concern damage to individuals as well as to Jewish property whose owners are no longer alive. The first steps have been taken on this level. a great deal remains to be done. The government of the Federal Republic will support the rapid conclusion of a law regarding restitution and its just implementation. A portion of identifiable Jewish property is to be returned. Further restitution will follow. It was now Germany's duty, Adenauer continued, to resolve this issue so as to ease the way to an inner purification. The reparations law passed the Bundestag on May 18, 1953. The 14 members of the Communist Party rejected it, appealing to German nationalism. The Social Democratic Party supported reparations unanimously. For the government, the outcome was more ambiguous. 106 members of parliament from the CDU-led coalition voted yes, 86. Primarily from the CDU's conservative Bavarian wing, abstained. Despite these parliamentary reservations, Adenauer had achieved his goal. The historian Jeffrey Herf has summarized the benefits reaching Israel from Germany. The West German deliveries to Israel of ships, machine tools, trains, autos, medical equipment, and more amounted to between 10 and 15% of annual Israeli imports. According to reports of the Federal Republic, restitution payments to individual survivors of Nazi political, racial, and religious persecution, most of whom were Jewish survivors, amounted to 40.4 billion German marks by 1971, 77 billion marks by 1986, about 96 billion marks by 1995, and would total about 124 billion marks in all. Nevertheless, Israel's citizens were deeply divided over the prospect of accepting blood money as some kind of expiation for genocidal slaughter. Debates in the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, were fiercely contested and accompanied by street demonstrations. Throughout, Adenauer maintained personal contact with Nahum Goldman, the founder of the World Jewish Congress. The Federal Republic would establish full diplomatic relations with Israel in 1965, 2 years after Adenauer's departure from office. The following year, Adenauer visited Israel, by then the home of some 150,000 survivors of the Holocaust, as a private citizen. When he arrived he said, "This is one of the most solemn and beautiful moments of my life. Never did I think, when I became chancellor, that I would one day be invited to visit Israel." Despite this opening, the visit was the occasion for an eruption of tension, perhaps unsurprising, between the 90-year-old Adenauer and the Israeli Prime Minister, Levi Eshkol. "We have not forgotten and we shall never forget," Eshkol said to Adenauer at a dinner he was giving in the German statesman's honor, "the terrible Holocaust in which we lost 6 million of our people." German-Israeli relations cannot be normal relations. He added that Germany's reparations to Israel were only symbolic and could not erase the tragedy which occurred. Ever composed, Adenauer replied, "I know how difficult it is for the Jewish people to forget the past, but should you fail to recognize our goodwill, nothing good can come of it." The most memorable images of Adenauer's time in Israel came from for all involved, wrenching visit to Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust Memorial and Museum, located on the western slope of Mount Herzl in Jerusalem. Maintaining a dignified silence, Adenauer was led into the Remembrance Chamber, a cavernous, dimly lit hall with a roof resembling a tent canopy, where he was invited to kindle a flame and lay a wreath at a memorial to the unknown victims of the death camps. Unexpectedly presented with a badge bearing the Hebrew word for remember, he replied, "Even without this badge, I never could have forgotten." 2 crises, Suez and Berlin. For Adenauer, the end of the occupation and the introduction of Germany into the European and international order marked the culmination of a historic effort. But history does not grant respites. A year after the restoration of German sovereignty in 1955, the Middle East conflict challenged the premises underlying the NATO alliance. In late October 1956, Adenauer was shaken by the U.S. decision to sponsor a UN General Assembly resolution condemning the Franco-British military operation to reverse the Egyptian nationalization of the Suez Canal. Adenauer had assumed that the alliance by definition would protect the core interests of each member. Now the U.S. formal opposition to Britain and France at the UN separated America from its key allies, while they were engaged in military action in what they conceived as their national interest. Might in some future circumstance others, and especially Germany, suffer a similar fate? Adenauer chose the occasion of a routine visit to Paris in November 1956 for a discussion of Euratom, the European Atomic Energy Community, to express this view, albeit in a very restricted group including French Prime Minister Guy Mollet and Foreign Minister Christian Pineau. Adenauer's train arrived in Paris on November 6, one day after Premier Bulganin of the Soviet Union, chief patron of and arms supplier to the Nasser regime, had threatened missile attacks on Britain and France if they continued their military operations along the Suez Canal. The French government greeted Adenauer with unusual warmth. A company of the Garde Civile gave the salute. The two national anthems were played. A member of Adenauer's entourage described the scene. The Chancellor took the salute like a statue, motionless. I was thinking of the scene at the National Cemetery in Arlington near Washington, in 1953. Even the most hard-boiled must have been touched by the significance of the moment and its symbolism. In the most serious hour France had experienced since the end of the war, the two governments were standing shoulder to shoulder. Adenauer learned of America's refusal to arrest a run on the pound sterling, a major blow to its British ally, during the Paris trip. He was dismayed but not to the point of questioning the significance of NATO. On the contrary, he thought it imperative for Europe to maintain its ties to America. The NATO alliance, he argued, was the most important component of the security of every European country. He warned his hosts against public controversy with the United States, and especially against any kind of retaliation, even verbal. Rather, America's European allies should enhance their cooperation within Europe. France and England will never be powers comparable to the United States and the Soviet Union. Not Germany, either. There remains to them only one way of playing a decisive role in the world, that is to unite to make Europe. We have no time to waste, Europe will be your revenge. It was during the Suez Crisis that Adenauer began to consider the need to use European integration, and particularly the Franco-German relationship, as a hedge against American vacillation. France, in the decade after de Gaulle's return